Organization Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Moe Carrick. Good to see you, Mo.
Hello, Julian. So good to see you as well. Thanks for having me.
That's good to have you. You are the CEO of Momentum Inc., and you help leaders, business owners, and entrepreneurs tackle their stickiest challenges with culture, people leadership, and team dynamics. And we're going to be exploring rethinking women's roles in defining masculinity at work. So it should be an interesting discussion and conversation. What do you love? The first question, what do you love about what you do, Mo?
Gosh, there's so much I love about what I do. Probably the same for you, Julian. But I think my favorite thing, I was actually pondering this the other day on a walk with my dog, is watching leaders actually experience success in helping their organization start to really kick it. Whether it's the results that they're getting or the culture that they're building. It's just really fun. And when leaders start to get it, business owners, founders, it makes everything possible in their business, which of course benefits the people who work there, the families that support them, and the communities that they live in the world at large. So for me, it kind of comes back to that joy of watching the wheels turn for business owners and leaders when they're starting to really get the role that people and culture play in their success. It's exciting.
Yeah, it almost feels a privilege, doesn't it, to witness that and see that happen.
Well, totally. And I don't know about you, but for me, I get to work with a lot of different kinds of businesses really quite closely. I advise CEOs and their teams right up close. So I get to see the inner workings of a variety of industries and sectors, which, many of the issues they face are very similar, but some are quite different. And I find that really interesting in terms of my own learning as well. And like you said, that privilege of being there as a strategic partner with what they're trying to do with their goals. It is a privilege.
Yeah, and I like the variety, but also the fact that I do learn from everybody I interact with, and I always see it as a learning opportunity, and I reflect after, well, I've done a facilitation day or a one-to-one. I reflect and think how I can hone my craft better and take the learnings from that as well.
Well, absolutely. It's, learning in our work role is one of the needs we have of work. And I notice that as I age, my desire to learn doesn't decrease. In fact, in some ways it increases because I have more bandwidth to think about what's possible. So yeah, it feels good.
So we're talking about sort of reshaping workplace masculinity, and I want to, sounds a sort of a strange question to ask you right at the start is what sparked your interest in this, in exploring women's roles in defining workplace masculinity? I just want to get, obviously I know you're a woman, but I just want to get your what sort of why did it sort of really spark your interest and passion about it?
Yeah, thanks for that sensitive question because it is odd, and I know we want to jump right into the deep end because it's important. And of course, right now it's particularly very temporally sensitive in terms of what's happening at a meta level and some things that some big leaders in the tech industry are talking about in terms of notions of masculinity at work. So for me, I think the interest was born from two main levers. One is that over the course of my career, the vast majority of my clients and partners, when I was an internal consultant and coach, as well as in the 24 years that I've owned Momentum, the vast majority of my clients have been men. Let's face it, men dominate the C-suite still. That's my sweet spot. And so I've learned about how to do white guy. Because that's the majority of people in my sector. And I believe in those men, and I've been privileged to watch their learning, and I'm honored to have worked with them. I have women clients for sure, and I have clients that are not white and do not identify as male for sure. But when we look at a percentage basis, I have found myself working more often with men, and many times that work centers on their leadership opportunities, particularly in the realm of emotional intelligence, how to build healthy connection. And I began to get really curious, like what's happening that men are not given as much access to skill development in those areas as they are other skills, right? Because I was seeing really different trends come forward around what men were seeking in their leadership practice. So that was sort of like the early work that I started to notice as I was working with clients and also as I was doing the research for my 3 books. And that became really interesting. The other side of it, though, I think, is that I love men. I say this in my TED Talk, right? I loved my father. I love my brother. I'm a wife. I'm a ex-wife. I'm a parent of 3 men and 1 woman. And I have noticed real differences in those roles for the men that I love and that I support and that I care about and who also help uplift and support me. I've watched them navigate some very, very difficult times in the last 15, 20 years for men in the meta environment. You know, we see overall that men aren't doing so well. Highest rates of addiction here in the US, highest rates of both being perpetrators and victims of gun violence, highest opioid addictions, highest suicide rates for men and boys today. So when we scan the world, we see that men are not doing so well. And I've seen my own family in particular struggle at times to get the support they need for the challenges they've faced, which I'm happy to say more about that. But it's gotten me really curious around what's going on. And as a feminist and as a woman, I think my lens as a younger woman especially was much more focused on women empowerment and how I could do it all in the ways that, you know, I wanted to as a young woman, especially. And I still am a feminist, but I'm noticing that if men are not thriving, we aren't going to get to real equity in the work at home and at work. So I feel like I have self-interest, both as a woman and as a partner to many amazing men.
Well, there's a lot in that conversation.
Yes, I fire hose you.
No, there's so many things I could think about, but I suppose just to sort of, frame the conversation about what's your perspective or view on what is reshaping workplace masculinity? What does that mean to you when we're sort of on the lens of this conversation?
I think to put it the most succinctly, I find that outdated notions of what good presence looks like at work, especially good leadership, negatively impacts all of us. And when I say outdated notions, what I mean is that much of how work norms and work culture unfolds, really globally, but especially in the West, in the global West, is based on notions that we inherited from the Industrial Revolution around leadership, around followership, and which roles are gendered in which way. And I think that those notions limit us in terms of what's possible. So to break it down, we can see that there was actually a very good research study by John Gerzema and Michael D'Antonio that was published in their book called The Athena Doctrine. And they did a big study, more than 100,000 research subjects, where they looked at what are the qualities of leadership in organizations that are going to be the most important for the next 50 years? Question 1. Question 2, which of those leadership qualities do you see as masculine and feminine? And what was fascinating is that, hands down, the qualities that were seen as the most necessary for the next 50 years of business success and organizational success were also seen as the most feminine. So things like empathy, compassion, connection, patience. Now, the other qualities that were seen as more masculine, some of those inherited notions like being directive, authoritative, decisive, analytical, those still matter. They didn't fall off the radar, but they became less important. And yet we see in the workplace today, I believe, an overemphasis on outdated skills that are traditionally seen as masculine that aren't actually creating the kind of resilient, engaged workforces that the world requires today.
And do you think it's helpful that we label things like masculine and feminine? Because and I know the traits you talked about, kindness, compassion, patience, as being feminine, and then suddenly we've got the masculine type of sort of traits. Do you think that helps, or do you think that sort of creates a thing? Well, if I'm a man, I've got to be masculine. I've got to be a man, as opposed to I don't want to be like a woman although not, you know what I mean? It gets a little bit messy in our heads. And I'm thinking, is there a better narrative that could help us create? Because I agree, I think having compassion, empathy are really valuable aspects of leadership. In my head, I don't see them as a feminine trait.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, is there a different narrative we could have on that to help people sort of grab hold of that?
Gosh, yes, I think so. And I love that. And I would be really pleased if we could sort of ungender our notions of leadership in the context of the workplace, to be that what a good leader looks like includes the full spectrum of behaviors that facilitate connection and performance. Unfortunately, I think we carry around some limiting beliefs that disproportionately impact us in various ways. And so, like, two examples that I'll bring up. One is we know from data that women who show up as authoritative and decisive are typically seen more negatively as leaders and in the workplace than men who show up in that way, which impacts their careers. And they're really, in many cases, they're copying what they see rewarded.
Yes.
Like ambition. But then when they do it, like when I'm ambitious, it doesn't look the same to the world as when you're ambitious. So I have to learn some different ways for my ambition to show up. I maybe have to soften it, or I have to modify it so that ambition as a positive quality looks positive in me. I think the same is true for men. You know, Jennifer Bosom, who's a University of Florida researcher, she says that men have a much more narrow band of emotional expression at work and at home than women do. So if a man at work, for example, is experiencing tenderness or fear, or wants to take his full leave when he becomes a parent in order to bond with his child, he is often facing recrimination, judgment, and shame as being weak or less ambitious than maybe he should be as a provider. And even just the notion of provider, I think, limits men in terms of what I hear from men I know that are for example, stay-at-home parents who feel really alone around being able to say, actually, I'm a parent right now, because society at large is biased towards them being a provider. So I think that's some of the ways that, yes, ideally, I'd love to degender these qualities, but I think on the journey to making that real, and embracing human intelligence as needing to be present across the whole gender spectrum, I think we have to also begin to learn how to shed some of what we've inherited. Does that make sense?
No, and you're talking about, they call it the double bind, don't they? Where they, the sort of traditional female traits, compassion, kindness, are seen as weak in terms of leadership, but then they adopt a masculine to fit in with the masculine perspective that's what leadership is good at, as in to be all sort of strong and sort of, and it appears aggressive and it comes across not very nice, as we all
it can, yeah,
and experiencing that. So and you're now you've flipped it, because it happens for men who want to be more compassionate and kind, and then that has a perception perhaps to them or others that they're being weak about things and not hard enough as a leader. So it's quite a difficult dilemma. How can we help leaders be better leaders? Because we're talking leaders generally here, because I think the combination of those factors are really important. We need people to make decisions. We need people to lead. We need decisiveness, all that, but we also need that compassion and kindness with it as well. How do we create that in a workplace that is still got remnants, perhaps less in Gen Z, but certainly within our generation, of that sort of backdrop or history bias or unconscious bias there? How can we sort of help change that within the workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one way we can do it is to really just notice it, right? Change always starts with noticing, like, where are our preconceptions maybe impacting how we're seeing things in our organizations. And I think another has to do with valuing the development of the full spectrum of skills in men and women and everything in between, that create positive connection and relational intelligence at work without fear, help validate those things. And I'll give you an example of a time I saw this sort of transition happen. This was many years ago, but I was working with a CEO who had, as many of us as CEOs do, to do some layoffs. And he was racked up about this. I was coaching him. He was just distraught. And he made a presentation he was going to make a presentation to all employees. They were cutting about 10% of their workforce. And he decided to practice it with his leadership team. And he practiced his presentation, which was the announcement of the layoffs. And in that presentation, he had all the data. I had not seen it ahead of time. I was there when he was practicing it. All the data, all the facts. And it was kind of, I would call it almost a clinical presentation about the layoffs. And his team listened. They listened, and when he was done, he said, how do you think that went? Do you think that would resonate well with the employees, as we get through this very tough day? And his CFO, who I really respect, we have been doing a lot of work on team health and emotional intelligence. He said to that CEO, "Tell me how you actually are feeling." And he said, "I'm terrified and I'm sad. Some of my friends are on the list of being let go, and it breaks my heart." And he actually got like a little you could see the emotion in his face. He wasn't weeping, but he definitely was. You could feel this tender. Now, this was in the safety of his leadership team. And the CFO said, "I think your presentation could use more of that." And he reworked it a bit so that when he talked to the team, he still shared the data, the facts, the reason why the layoffs were happening. That did matter for people to have context and color. But he also showed a little bit of his heart, of how hard this was for him, knowing how hard it would be for those that were staying, which was who he was speaking with, those that were staying. And it really warmed his presentation. So for me, like, that example is really powerful around that CFO courageously offering some feedback that allowed this CEO to say, "Oh, wait a second, I'm acting this way. I'm saying it this way because I think that's what I've been taught to do. But actually, there's a way for me to show up here that might be more connecting and help us get through this hard change together more positively." And it was vulnerable for him to do that. Like, it was,
and it's sort of humanizing the situation, isn't it? Really making it a real life. We're affecting human beings here and their livelihoods, and actually there's a thing to be aware of that feeling. And I think rather than just, as you say, being clinical about it.
Yes, and it was a subtle shift. He didn't have to have a personality transplant to do that. He just needed to shift a little bit of what he shared and how he allowed himself to be seen, that really created a much more engaged and positive experience, even in very bad news. I think that's how we do it.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's keeping to who you are authentically, as in you're not shifting, you're not taking on another gender or perspective. It completely transforms. You're actually just doing a little shift, aren't you? And I think that's a subtle difference. Just perhaps just bringing down the barrier and just showing a little bit of your human, vulnerable nature, which can be quite challenging and quite scary to do that, because obviously people feel uncomfortable with that, and men notoriously struggle with that more than females. We know that's just how we're built, and I think that's okay. That's how we're built. So we're wired slightly differently, but it's being aware of that and actually making sure that we can bring that emotion into it as well.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that I find really powerful is, it is perhaps part how we're built. I think it's also how we're taught. I think about the meta messages that come to little boys. One of my 3 young men, when they were a child, was a very, very sensitive child and cried all the time. And especially in arenas like sports or competition, his tears were shamed out of him. Boys don't cry, man up. And so the messaging he got as a little boy was like, that part of myself, that sadness, that fear, it cannot show. So he developed defense mechanisms to protect himself against that. Now, this human has also struggled with substance abuse disorder and mental health challenges and is doing beautifully today, but partly because of the courageous work they've done to get the help they need to navigate those hard feelings. And those feelings are human. You know, the little boy who's crying on the field is feeling very normal feelings, you know, but when we say boys don't cry and man up, we don't offer great alternatives for how do I get through those feelings. And of course, that all over many years, that adds up to what we bring into the workplace, doesn't it?
Well, it creates men who don't share, don't talk about things, don't be vulnerable. We know that, you know, suicide in men is significantly higher than women because they don't talk to people, they don't share about anything. And, you know, I've had that all my life as well, that whole sort of man up, you can't cry, you just got to crack on type of thing. And it's that sort of debate, isn't it? The nature nurture. And I know we are wired differently generally, as a generalization here. But I think there's perhaps some societal things that have shaped us to be who we are. And I think also that, you know, the role models of leadership, whether they're good or bad, have always been, you know, male, white, and also act in a way that's more masculine, and almost that's where the power is, and therefore that's how you've got to do it. And so you play the game, that's how you be it. So either you're a man or a female, that's how you approach. And we know that obviously in, you know, boards are getting better in terms of diversity. And I don't like quotas. I don't like tick boxes. I just find it, I know it makes a point and it keeps things on the agenda and it can be helpful in that way. But it becomes to tokenism, and I don't like that. But we know that, you know, there's lots of research, a diverse board, male, female, ethnic, all different things perform better than, you know, in performance. So how can we encourage or create, how have you found, observed, more female getting into more C-suite positions, you know, in terms of, I suppose, nurturing that more?
Yeah, so much there that you're speaking of. And I think that, yeah, I'm with you on the quotas. And I, as you were talking, I was thinking, Julian, about, you know, is the answer not so much about counting as it is looking for the skills that are diverse? You know, for example, having men who are on boards who also are strong at social capital, who also can build connection and have care for the work they do, which again doesn't necessarily help with overall equity. But I think that one of the ways we continue to build the kinds of diverse teams we need, whether it's at the board level or the C-suite level or just in leadership or teams, you know, around the world, is we continue to talk about what is necessary and what the human experience is. And we seek diversity of style, of personality, of gender, of race, of age, because we know it's better. It's better for community. You know, it's better for conflict. It's better for innovation. It's better for creativity to have multiple perspectives. But when we have multiple perspectives, we know we're going to have more conflict. So we need to have higher skills for resolving conflict. And for me, this is where this reshaping workplace masculinity becomes so important. We often say at Momentum that connection is the future of everything, right? It's the future of everything. And we're not kidding, like when we say that, whether it's in your frontline teams, in your executive teams, in your boards, in your community at large. And so for me, connection bumps right up against one of those outdated notions of masculinity, which is about rugged individualism, right? Which is, I can do it alone. I can do it alone, which I don't know about you, but I certainly inherited my own fair share of rugged individualism. Like I can do it alone, dude. You know what I mean? Like that I can. And yet that is not best for me. So I have to work my own demons inside my head to allow help, to show my own vulnerabilities, to partner in a way that is interdependent, not just Moe being the entrepreneur who's standing alone while everybody else watches, you know. And I think that taps into something else you mentioned around Suicide rates. I recently posted on LinkedIn a post that went viral, which I don't care about, but it was interesting to me that it tapped a nerve, because I had witnessed or been privy to my 10th suicide in my 20 years in business, of actual business associates, not people in community, all of them white men. And I find myself devastated at what I've heard from the people who worked with, and in many cases lived with, these men, because they knew nothing of the suffering that was being endured. Absolutely nothing. So part of the trauma, of course, of death by suicide is not knowing why. But I think when we debunk rugged individualism and we create a way to say, hey, we are in community, we need to connect, we now open up tremendous possibility for accomplishing things that we can't do alone. And that's like a long way around, I think, how we continue to invite differences into our teams and our boards.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of my sort of pillars of building personal resilience is community, which is connection, really, and having people around you who you can laugh with, you can cry with, who can support you, help you, advise you, challenge you as well. So it's not just about just they're actually saying, I think you're doing something wrong here. I'm talking close people here. And I've over years have built, friendships and business associates close like that now. And I've got a number of individuals, male and female, who I can rely on in various formats of whatever, both business or personal. And I think that's really important, where you can sort of share, actually, I'm really finding this tough, or, whether it's going through COVID, whether it's going through your business, or, or a personal thing at home, and where you can just share it. You don't want answers. And likewise, I can support other people as well. And I think that it's becoming more of a thing, and with men, and to do that, but we've still got, I think, a long way to go.
No, good for you. Good for you. And I don't know about you, but for me, it actually takes active energy. Like, even especially post-COVID, I felt like I became a little insular, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And my husband and I talked about how we're becoming a little housebound. Like, some of our friendships dropped off, and I really am aware. I've always traveled a lot for work, and I've been a working mom and a single mom and stuff. And I've often noticed that if I don't pay attention to investing in the community of people in my immediate circle, like, they do fall off. Like, those relationships need tending. And that is vulnerable to do. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's the outgoing Surgeon General here in the US, wrote 3 really, well, more, I'm sure, but 3 that I'm aware of, powerful reports during his most recent tenure. One on, which is the Surgeon General's report on workplace mental health and well-being. Another was his report on our global loneliness epidemic. And the third is his report on the impact of social media on our well-being, especially young people. And I think you look at that data, and it really shows up with what we know is true, but we sometimes minimize, which is that what matters in the end, and what matters to us day to day, is mutually supportive relationships. Period.
And but that, as you say, requires energy. You got to nurture it. You got to be intentional about it. Sometimes happen naturally, but generally you've got to have an intention about it and put the effort. Like in any relationship, it's a relationship at the end of the day. It's and you have some bumps with all that as well in relationships to sort of work through. But I think it's really important. I'm going to ask you. It could be deemed as a controversial question, just to sort of finish, just to get your perspective on this. Really, is how would you respond to those who might say to you that we're feminizing the workplace?
Oh, yeah. I would say it's about damn time. That's what I would say, Julian. If I was unadulterated with my opinion. And what I mean by that is not that it's becoming girly. What I would mean by that is it's about time we embrace the full spectrum of human capacity to make work a place in which everyone thrives. Because when that happens, we get kick-ass results. We do the phenomenal things together that we can't do alone, and we make more money. So I would say it's about time that we embrace the full spectrum of human experience. We know so much more now about human intelligence than we knew in the Industrial Revolution. And business has changed exponentially. So we need to change how we show up. And I'm actually very inspired by the way I see some of the younger generations bringing their energy forward around broader notions of what good looks like, in the workplace. So I would say, yes, let's bring it. And I would probably try to, as you mentioned, I would try to move away from the binary notions of feminine and masculine.
Yeah.
But it's about time.
Brilliant stuff. Well, you'd have to answer that way if you're a feminist. There we go. So,
well, yeah. And also, you were talking about your own community and the investment it takes. I'm really struck, we do a lot of work in our coaching practice with everyone, with people around how they grow their emotional intelligence. And I'm always struck with, in the emotional intelligence world, one of the key skills for emotional intelligence is, of course, interpersonal relationships. And when you really look at what interpersonal relationships and what it means in that assessment and in that data, the word that stands out for me is mutually beneficial. Interpersonal relationships. And for me, mutually beneficial means I have to be willing to be vulnerable with people. And a tiny story, my husband and I are in a change of roles. He is older than I and in semi-retirement. And I'm still working hard, growing my business and loving it. And so recently he's taken on a bunch more duties around the home, including cooking and shopping and things that I traditionally thought were my job as a woman. And what I'm noticing is I have to do some real work on myself to let him do that and to let him do it in the way he does it. Now, my husband happens to be a much better cook than I, which is delightful, lucky for me, right? But at the same time, I have to battle my own notions of what it means to be a good wife in order to receive the help that he provides with grace. Because it's easy for me to just hustle. Like he'll say, the other day, he said, I was going to go shopping. These are my thoughts for the next 3 dinners or whatever. And the first words out of my mouth were, no, that's fine. I got it. And he looked at me. He's like, why? Why are you saying that? I looked at your calendar. You have meetings scheduled all day. I don't. And that's that's mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah, it is.
And I got some work to do around how I receive that help. And I think that that's where the work really lies, isn't it, for each of us?
That's interesting. That's a good one to end on, actually, that mutual support and approach, definitely. I've enjoyed our conversation, Mo. Some great insights there, and hopefully something that will provoke people to think a bit as leaders listening to this. And doesn't mean we have all the answers, but they can start thinking about it for themselves and exploring it. If people want to know a bit more about you or get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Oh, thanks so much. And thanks for having me and for, bravely embracing the conversation as we help organizations thrive. It matters so much to our well-being to thrive at work. People can find me on LinkedIn, just at Moe Carrick. My website also, momentum.com, spelled with an E, has a host of resources, and people can sign up for our twice weekly Work Matters newsletter. I'd love to hear from people in either of those spaces.
Thank you, Mo, for coming on.